The ballroom that night was suffocating, filled with forced laughter and the cloying scent of expensive perfume. I stood beside Mark, the man I'd spent my prime, supporting the man I'd practically carried into that director's chair. I truly believed this was his night of glory and the night he would finally show me a shred of appreciation. But then a major partner leaned in and asked, "And this must be your incredible fiancé." Mark froze for a heartbeat. Then he took a casual sip of his scotch and flashed a condescending smirk I'd never seen before. "Oh, don't misunderstand," he said, his voice booming through the sudden chilling silence of the room. "Erin, she's just temporary, a placeholder until I find someone more suited for my long-term plans." The room went ice cold. Pitying stares washed over me like a wave. In a single breath, he had turned me into a cheap public joke on his own birthday. But Mark made one fatal mistake. He forgot exactly who I am. As a district school administrator, I don't just manage budgets, I hold the keys to his entire professional existence. I didn't argue. I didn't shed a single tear. I simply reached into my purse, paid for my own meal, and vanished like a ghost. Mark thought he was asserting his power, but in reality he had just signed the death warrant of his career. Don't turn away, because what happens next will leave you breathless. From a fateful encounter with his powerful aunt to a brilliant maneuver that leaves a multi-million-dollar contract in ashes, you are about to witness the ultimate payoff the moment this arrogant man returns to his office, only to find that even his chair has been erased. This isn't just revenge, it's an intellectual purge that every woman will applaud. My name is Erin, and at 38 years old, I have spent the last decade building a reputation as a district school administrator who thrives on precision policy and the quiet power of efficiency. I am the woman who ensures the gears of the educational system turn without friction, a professional who prides herself on seeing the fine print long before anyone else even notices the page is turned. I have always believed that if you manage the details, the big picture will take care of itself. A philosophy that applied to my career, my finances, and until recently, my relationship with Mark. The gala was held at a prestigious waterfront venue, the kind of place where the air itself feels expensive, thick with the scent of lilies and the ozone of high-stakes ambition. It was a fundraiser for the regional arts program, but for Mark, it was a stage. As his fiancé, I had spent weeks helping him prepare for this night, ghostwriting his talking points and researching the philanthropic histories of every board member in attendance. I was wearing a tailored navy silk gown that whispered rather than screamed a choice intended to make him look grounded and successful. As we moved through the crowd, I felt the familiar weight of his hand on the small of my back, but as the evening progressed, that touch began to change. It became less of a gesture of affection and more like a tool of positioning, as if he were nudging an ornament into the perfect light. I watched him closely, a habit born from years of auditing complex budgets. I noticed the way his eyes darted toward the entrance every time a more influential donor arrived, and how his posture stiffened when he spotted Julian Vance, a billionaire venture capitalist with a sudden interest in school board politics. Mark's transformation was subtle to the untrained eye, but to me it was jarring. His laughter grew louder, more performative. He began to lean away from me physically, creating a gap that hadn't been there when we arrived. He wasn't just working the room. He was curated, shedding the skin of a committed man to appear like a shark, unbound, hungry, and entirely available for whatever alliances might serve his next move. The moment of fracture happened near the buffet beneath a shimmering crystal chandelier. We were joined by Julian Vance and his wife, along with 2 other senior board members. The conversation had turned toward the recent success of the district's vocational initiative, a project I had personally spent 6 months structuring. Julian turned to Mark with a nod of genuine respect. He asked if I was the brilliant mind behind the compliance framework that had made the project so airtight, his tone suggesting that a man like Mark was lucky to have such a formidable partner. The room seemed to inhale. A natural lull in the surrounding chatter occurred, one of those rare, vacuum-like silences where every word carries 3 times its normal weight. Mark didn't hesitate. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, let out a dry chuckle, and looked directly at Julian, bypassing me entirely. The smirk on his face was cold, a calculated expression of dismissiveness that I had never seen him direct at me in private. He spoke with a terrifying clarity. He told Julian not to misunderstand that I was just temporary, a placeholder, until his long-term plan really kicked in. The impact was physical, like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. I expected a gasp, a frown of disapproval, or perhaps a defensive joke from one of the board members who knew how much work I did. But what followed was far more devastating: the silence of the accomplices. No one defended me. Julian Vance looked down into his glass, swirling his ice with sudden fascination. His wife offered me a tight, pitying smile that felt like a slap. The others simply shifted their weight, their eyes drifting toward the ceiling or the far wall. In that collective withdrawal, I saw the ugly truth of the world Mark was so desperate to join. To these people, and now to Mark, I wasn't a person with feelings, history, or merit. I was an accessory that had just been publicly devalued, and the crowd had unanimously voted to allow the humiliation to stand. It was a silent agreement that a man's ego, especially one on the rise, was worth far more than a woman's dignity. In the past, perhaps a younger version of me would have felt the heat of tears or the urge to demand an apology. But my years in administration had taught me the value of a poker face and the tactical advantage of silence. I didn't flinch. I didn't let my hand shake as I set my glass down on a passing server's tray. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the stale air of the room, and I observed Mark. He looked energized by his own cruelty, basking in the perceived strength of being a man who could discard a partner as easily as a used napkin. He thought he was showing the room he was a leader. I saw a man who had forgotten that the person who built his pedestal could also be the one to dismantle it. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a scene. Without a word to Mark, I walked toward the cloakroom. I retrieved my wrap, then moved to the valet station. I didn't wait for him to realize I was gone. I paid the valet myself, tipping him well for his speed, and then I found the host of the event. I handed him a small, handwritten note I had scrawled on the back of a business card, thanking him for the lovely evening and apologizing for an urgent matter that required my immediate departure. I was calm, my movements fluid and professional. I wasn't retreating in shame or fleeing in a fit of pique. I was withdrawing to a place of clarity where I could evaluate the data. As the cool night air hit my face, the reality of the situation solidified. This wasn't just a drunken slip or a bad joke. It was a revelation of a long-term strategy. Mark had used me as a scaffolding while he climbed the social and professional ladder, and now that he thought he was near the top, he was ready to kick the support away. He had spent years benefiting from my intellect and my loyalty, all while secretly categorizing me as a transient part of his life. As I walked out of that restaurant, I realized he hadn't embarrassed me. He had tested how much he could get away with. The drive home was silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of my turn signal, a sound that usually grounded me, but tonight felt like a countdown. I sat in my darkened living room for a long time, the navy silk of my gown feeling like a costume I had outgrown. By the time the sun began to peek through the blinds, I wasn't exhausted. I was calibrated. I went to the office early, my heels echoing in the hollow corridors of the district administration building. In this space, I am not an accessory or a placeholder. I am the architect of the invisible. Most people think school administration is about cafeteria menus and bus schedules, but at this level, it is a high-stakes game of fiduciary responsibility and forensic accounting. My desk is where the visionary dreams of men like Mark come to be vetted against the cold, hard reality of state law and taxpayer accountability. I handle the vendor compliance, the audit trails, and the grueling budget reconciliations that keep the district from collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. For years, Mark had thrived on the what and the why, while I quietly, tirelessly handled the how. He was the face of the prestigious vocational initiative, but I was the one who had spent my weekends ensuring the procurement process didn't violate a dozen federal statutes. I was the engine that made his rise look effortless, a fact he had mistaken for me being a mere passenger in his life. As I sat at my mahogany desk, the morning light hitting the stacks of manila folders, my mind began to sift through the archives of our relationship. Now that the veil of us had been shredded, I could see the pattern of erasure with startling clarity. I remembered a dinner with his regional director 2 years ago when Mark described my help on his strategic plan as a pro bono favor from a friend, rather than the 40 hours of expert consulting I had provided. At the time, I had smiled thinking he was just trying to sound more independent. I remembered the way he introduced me at the Christmas mixer as being with him for the time being, a phrasing I had dismissed as a slip of the tongue or a quirk of his Midwestern speech. But sitting here now surrounded by the evidence of my own competence, I realized it was a systematic campaign. Mark had been carefully eroding my presence in his professional narrative for a long time. He wanted the world to believe he was a self-made titan, and to do that he had to make sure I remained a footnote, a temporary fixture that could be removed without damaging the structure. He hadn't just insulted me at the gala. He had finally gone public with the lie he had been telling himself for years. He had taken the credit for every milestone while I had taken the liability for every risk. I pulled a specific file from the bottom of my drawer, one that had been sitting heavy on my conscience for weeks. It was a vendor contract for a new digital infrastructure project, a massive deal that Mark had been aggressively pushing through the board. The vendor was a firm that on paper looked impeccable, but my internal audit had flagged a series of shell companies that eventually led back to a distant cousin of Mark's. It was a classic conflict of interest violation, the kind of mistake that ends careers and starts grand jury investigations. For weeks, I had been working late, meticulously drafting a series of supplemental memos and clarification requests that would give Mark a way to withdraw the proposal gracefully or find a legitimate alternative. I was preparing to save him from himself, to use my expertise to shield him from his own greed and recklessness. I had been his safety net, weaving a web of protection so fine he didn't even know it was there. I looked at the signature line on the cover sheet where my initials were required to move the file to the final approval stage. If I signed it, I was complicit in his deception. If I didn't, the board's internal compliance system, the one I had designed to be ruthless, would catch the discrepancy within 48 hours. In the quiet of my office, a profound sense of peace washed over me. It wasn't anger that drove me in that moment, but a cold administrative logic. Mark had declared to the world that I was temporary, a person with no long-term stake in his life or his future. If I was truly temporary, then it was no longer my responsibility to manage his risks or safeguard his reputation. I didn't need to attack him, and I certainly didn't need to scream. All I had to do was my job exactly as it was written in the manual. I reached for my red pen, but I didn't sign the document. Instead, I simply filed the original flagged report into the district's central compliance queue, without the protective memos I had spent 20 hours writing. I stripped away the layers of context and explanations I had crafted to hide his mistakes. I decided that from this moment on, Mark would have to stand on his own merits with no one to catch him when he stumbled over his own ambition. The system I had built to protect the district would now function exactly as intended, and Mark was about to find out how unforgiving that system could be when the person who usually silenced the alarms decided to let them ring. By calling me temporary, he gave me permission to stop protecting him. The silence following my decision to release that compliance report was the most honest thing I had felt in years. For the next week, I moved through the district office with a renewed sense of clarity, watching as the invisible machinery I had spent my life perfecting began to churn. Mark, meanwhile, seemed to be operating under the delusion that his public insult was merely a minor social hiccup that could be smoothed over with the right amount of leverage. He knew I was cold, but he underestimated the depth of my resolve. That was why, on a Tuesday morning when the rain was drumming rhythmically against my office window, he appeared at my door with his secret weapon in tow. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Aunt Eleanor. In the world of regional education, Eleanor was a titan, a retired consultant who had practically written the state's ethics handbook. She was a woman of sharp angles, impeccable pearls, and a gaze that could dismantle a person's confidence in seconds. Mark flashed me a charming, boyish smile, the kind he used when he wanted to remind me of the good times, and suggested that we all go to lunch at the bistro across the street. I saw through it instantly. This was a Trojan horse. He believed that by bringing Eleanor, he could shame me into a polite reconciliation, using the presence of a matriarch he respected to force me back into my role as his supportive temporary partner. I agreed to go not because I was softening, but because I knew Eleanor. She wasn't just his aunt. She was a woman who valued the integrity of the system above the sanctity of bloodlines, and I wanted to see exactly how much she knew about her nephew's recent activities. The bistro was crowded, but Mark had secured a quiet table in the back where the clatter of silverware felt muffled. As we ordered, he tried to steer the conversation towards safe familial waters, talk of upcoming holidays and shared memories. But Eleanor had no interest in small talk. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me, then at Mark. She began to ask questions that were far too specific to be casual curiosity. She asked about the district's current protocols for third-party vendor reviews and whether the new digital infrastructure project was undergoing a standard compliance audit. Mark chuckled, waving his hand dismissively and telling her that everything was under control, but I could see the slight twitch in his jaw. Eleanor wasn't listening to him. She was watching me. She was smelling smoke and she was looking for the fire. I kept my tone neutral and professional, providing factual clinical answers that confirmed the district was indeed tightening its oversight. When she asked if any red flags had been raised recently regarding conflict of interest disclosures, I didn't look at Mark. I simply stated that the system was designed to flag any irregularity and that several files were currently in the queue for a deeper dive. Mark's face went slightly pale, but he remained silent, likely thinking I was still protecting him by not naming names. He didn't realize that by being honest with Eleanor, I was handing her the match she had been looking for. The atmosphere at the table shifted from tense to icy as Eleanor began to recount her own days as a consultant. She spoke about the importance of legacy and the absolute necessity of trust in public service. Then she mentioned a specific vocational contract from 3 years ago, a massive deal that had been the cornerstone of Mark's early career. She smiled thinly, noting that she took great pride in having vetted that particular agreement to ensure it met the highest ethical standards before it went to the board. My heart stopped. I felt the air leave my lungs as a piece of the puzzle I hadn't even known was missing suddenly clicked into place. I had processed that contract 3 years ago. I had seen the approval signature that bore Eleanor's name. But looking at her now as she spoke about the contract with a strange, detached curiosity, I realized something horrifying. Eleanor had never seen that document. She wasn't reminiscing. She was testing the air. In that moment of chilling realization, I understood that Mark hadn't just been reckless with budgets. He had forged his own aunt's professional endorsement to bypass the board's scrutiny. He had used her name, her reputation, and her legendary integrity as a shield for his own ambition, betraying his own family as easily as he had betrayed me at the gala. The betrayal was no longer just a personal spat between a man and a woman who had outgrown their usefulness to one another. It had evolved into a systemic reckoning. Mark had crossed a line that even the most corrupt politicians in our district feared to touch. He had violated the law, the system, and the very person he was now using as a tool for reconciliation. I sat there watching Eleanor's eyes go as hard as flint as she caught the subtle change in my expression. She knew. She didn't need me to say it aloud. The silence between us was no longer awkward. It was a shared understanding of a coming storm. Mark sat between us, still oblivious, still trying to play the part of the dutiful nephew and the misunderstood fiancé, unaware that he had brought the one person to the table who would ensure his total destruction. He thought he was using Eleanor to manipulate me, but all he had done was lead her directly to the scene of his oldest and most dangerous crime. I realized then that my role in this story was changing. I was no longer just the woman who was stopping her protection. I was the witness to a collapse that had been years in the making. As we stood to leave, the weight of the forged document seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence, a ghost of a lie that was finally ready to speak. That lunch wasn't about reconciliation. It was about exposure. The chill from that lunch with Aunt Eleanor followed me back to the office, a cold clarity that settled deep in my bones. I didn't need to be a mind reader to know that a storm was coming. I had been the one who built the weather stations. I sat at my desk and pulled up the digital archives, my fingers hovering over the files that had once been the focus of my nights and weekends. These were the red flag documents, the messy trails of Mark's negligence and his half-baked schemes that I had previously fixed out of a misguided sense of love and partnership. In the past, I would have spent hours rewriting the internal memos using my expertise to massage the language, clarify the ambiguities, and tuck the risks into the shadows of administrative jargon. I had been his invisible shield, ensuring that his lack of due diligence never reached the eyes of the board. But this time, I didn't reach for the metaphorical eraser. I simply took the raw, unpolished documents, the ones that clearly showed his failure to vet vendors and his disregard for procurement timelines, and I filed them exactly as they were. I didn't add a single lie, nor did I exaggerate his mistakes. I merely removed the protection of my expertise. I followed the district's standard operating procedure to the very last punctuation mark, ensuring that every piece of evidence was indexed and accessible. I was no longer a gatekeeper. I was a conduit for the truth, knowing that the system I had spent a decade maintaining was perfectly capable of doing the rest of the work on its own. By Friday morning, the air in the administration building had shifted. Word began to circulate that an anonymous inquiry had been submitted to the State Oversight Committee, a request for a formal forensic audit of the district's largest contracts. I suspected Eleanor had been the one to strike the match, her sense of integrity finally overriding any familial loyalty, though it didn't matter who had started the fire. Usually when auditors arrive, the atmosphere is one of panic and desperate scrambling to clean up the files, and in years past, I would have been the one leading that charge to protect Mark's department. But when the team from the state auditor's office walked through our glass doors, I didn't flinch. I greeted them with a calm, professional smile and invited them into the conference room. When they asked for the digital keys to the procurement archives and the physical ledger for the last 3 fiscal years, I didn't hesitate. I handed them everything, offering full transparency as per the requirements of my job description. I saw the surprise in their eyes. They weren't used to an administrator who seemed so eager to show them where the bodies were buried. I wasn't being a whistleblower in the traditional sense. I was simply being a public servant who refused to lie for a man who had told the world I was disposable. The domino effect was instantaneous and brutal. As the auditors began to pull the threads of the contracts I had filed, the frantic phone calls from Mark started. He didn't come to my office at first. He sent a flurry of texts that grew increasingly desperate, shifting from, "We need to talk," to, "You need to fix this." When he finally cornered me in the basement records room, his composure had completely disintegrated. The arrogant man from the gala was gone, replaced by someone sweating through his expensive shirt, his eyes darting toward the security cameras. He didn't ask how I was. He begged me to go into the system and adjust the digital timestamps on a series of late-stage approvals for the digital infrastructure project. He tried to frame it as a technicality, a small favor to save our future. As he spoke, I calmly reached into my pocket and hit the record button on my phone. I didn't do it out of a desire for revenge, but for my own legal protection. In this district, being caught in a cover-up is a swifter career death than being caught in a mistake, and I had no intention of being dragged down into the grave he had dug for himself. I listened to him implicate himself in a dozen minor frauds, his voice cracking, as he realized that the temporary woman was the only thing standing between him and a career-ending scandal. Watching him crumble was like watching a house of cards finally meet a stiff breeze. He had built his entire reputation on a foundation of my labor and his own hubris, never realizing that the structure was only as strong as my willingness to hold it up. He kept talking about how we could get through this, still clinging to the idea that I was an extension of his will. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that his entire career had been a performance. He wasn't a visionary. He was a salesman who had run out of inventory. I felt a strange sense of detachment, a professional coldness that allowed me to see the situation for what it was, a necessary correction. The wind was knocking the cards down, and I wasn't going to spend another second trying to prop them up. I walked past him, leaving him in the dim light of the records room, surrounded by the paper evidence of his own undoing. I had spent years being the architect of his success, but I had finally resigned from the position. The audit was no longer a threat I had to manage. It was a process I was allowing to unfold. By the time he sensed something was wrong, the process no longer belonged to any of us. The following Monday arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness that seemed to coat the hallways like a layer of fine dust. Mark had spent the weekend on what he called a stress leave, a desperate attempt to create distance while he surely worked the phones trying to call in every favor he thought he was owed. He walked into the building at 8:45 a.m., shoulders squared, and chin tilted up in that familiar, practiced posture of a man who believed his charisma could still override his consequences. I watched him from the glass mezzanine as he approached the executive turnstiles. He reached for his badge with a flourish, ready to glide back into his world of high-level meetings and strategic planning. But as he swiped, the small LED light didn't flash green. It pulsed a sharp, rhythmic red. He frowned, swiped again with more force, and then a third time, his face flushing with a mixture of confusion and irritation. He looked toward the reception desk, expecting the usual warm greeting and the offer of a fresh espresso, but Sarah, the receptionist who had brought him coffee every morning for 3 years, didn't even look up from her monitor. She didn't acknowledge his presence at all, acting as though he were a stranger or a ghost. In the world of high-level education administration, we don't usually do the loud, dramatic firing with security guards and shouting matches. We do something much more terrifying. We perform a silent erasure. We simply stop the flow of information, deactivate the access, and wait for the person to realize they no longer exist within the system. The silence that followed him as he bypassed the turnstile by following a delivery person was deafening. He marched toward his corner office, but the physical reality of his situation was waiting for him in the hallway. Sitting right outside his door were 3 nondescript cardboard boxes, their flaps taped shut. His nameplate, once a proud slab of engraved brass, had been removed, leaving nothing but 2 small dark holes in the wood where the screws had been. He pushed the door open, but the room was already being transformed. A maintenance worker was already painting over a scuff on the wall where his degree had hung. Mark stood there, a man without a country, looking at the boxes that contained the sum total of his professional identity. He reached for his phone to check the internal directory, perhaps hoping it was all just a massive IT glitch, but his account had been purged. He was gone from the digital archives. His emails rerouted, his calendar wiped clean. The cold, hard reality began to settle in. The temporary woman he had mocked was actually the foundation upon which his entire status was built. And now that the foundation had moved, his world had simply collapsed into the basement. There was no HR meeting for him to manipulate, no board member he could charm back to his side. The audit had provided all the justification the district needed to move on without him, and they had done so with a speed that was almost surgical. I was in the break room when he finally found me pouring a cup of tea with a steady hand. He looked like he had aged a decade in the last 20 minutes, his expensive suit now looking slightly too large for his shrinking frame. He didn't yell. He hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and disbelief. He demanded to know if this was me, if I was the one who had finally decided to destroy him after all these years. He accused me of being vindictive, of throwing away our future because of one bad joke at a party. I set my cup down and looked at him with a calm that I knew would infuriate him more than any shout could. I told him quite truthfully that I didn't have to do anything at all. I explained that I had merely stopped doing the work of 3 people to make him look like one competent director. When you stop holding up a liar, they don't need a push. They fall all by themselves under the weight of their own fabrications. I watched the realization flicker in his eyes, the dawning horror that he had been an amateur playing at being a professional, while I had been the professional playing the role of the supportive fiancé. He had mistaken my silence for a lack of ambition and my service for a lack of power. The final blow, however, was yet to come. He began to bluster about his visionary vocational project, claiming that even if they fired him, the district would still be using his blueprints for the next 10 years. I smiled then, a small, sad smile for the man who truly believed his own lies. I informed him that the board hadn't just saved the project. They had officially transferred the lead to me. I revealed what I had never told him during our long nights of collaborative work. I hadn't just edited his strategic plans. I had written them from the first word to the last. He had been the face, but I was the architect, and the board had finally recognized that they didn't need a face that lied when they had the architect who could actually build. His jaw tightened, and he looked around the sterile break room searching for an ally or a way out, but the room was empty. The colleagues who had once laughed at his jokes were now busy in meetings he wasn't invited to. The aunt who had once been his shield was now his primary accuser. He was standing in a vacuum of his own, making a man who had burned every bridge while convinced he could fly. For the first time, he realized no one was coming to save him. The dust from Mark's professional implosion settled with a quiet finality that was far more satisfying than any public explosion could have been. In the months that followed, he didn't face a prison cell, but he faced something he dreaded far more: irrelevance. In the tight-knit community of educational administration, your reputation is the only currency that matters, and Mark had declared bankruptcy. The news of the audit and the irregularities in his department spread like wildfire through the regional networks, and suddenly the man who had been the rising star found every door in the state bolted shut. I heard through the grapevine that he eventually moved 3 states away, taking a junior coordinator position in a district half the size of ours, a role usually reserved for someone just out of their master's program. He was stripped of the prestige, the title, and the influence he had used my labor to build, forced to start over in the shadows where no one knew his name or cared about his vision. Perhaps the most stinging blow for him was Eleanor's reaction. After the forgery came to light, she didn't just distance herself from him. She severed the ties completely. She redirected the family trust and her considerable professional influence away from her nephew, choosing instead to reach out to me. We began meeting for tea every other Sunday, and in her I found the mentor I had always needed: a woman who saw my worth, not as a placeholder, but as a peer. The most shocking development, however, arrived in the form of a formal letter from the school board. They didn't just want me to continue leading the vocational project. They invited me to a private executive session to interview for the superintendent position, the very seat Mark had spent years coveting. During the interview, the board chairman, a man who had always seemed distant and formidable, looked at me with a startling amount of respect. He admitted that many members of the board had suspected for a long time that I was the true engine behind the district's successes, but they had harbored one nagging doubt. They wanted to see if I had the backbone to prioritize the integrity of the district over the messy entanglements of my personal life. They had watched the gala, and they had watched the audit. They explained that my temporary status in Mark's eyes had actually been the ultimate test of my character in theirs. They weren't looking for a visionary who could talk. They were looking for a leader who could stand firm when the world tried to make her small. By refusing to compromise my professional standards to save a sinking man, I had proven that I was the only person fit to lead the district into its next chapter. The transition to my new role was seamless, as if the seat had been waiting for me all along. I no longer had to ghostwrite brilliance for someone else. I simply spoke my own truth and watched it become policy. 3 months later, I found myself back at a gala, though the atmosphere was entirely different. This time, the venue was a historic ballroom downtown, and the event was a celebration of the district's new strategic direction. I wasn't the woman in the navy silk dress standing 3 paces behind a man. I was the keynote speaker. As I stood at the mahogany podium looking out over the sea of faces, I recognized many of the people who had been in the room on that fateful night of Mark's birthday. Julian Vance was there, as were the board members who had once looked into their wine glasses to avoid my eyes. But this time, their gaze was different. There was no pity, no condescension, and certainly no dismissal. They nodded in respect, their eyes following my every movement with an intensity that signaled they knew exactly who was in charge. I felt a profound sense of peace as I adjusted the microphone, my voice steady and resonant as it filled the vaulted ceiling. I wasn't there to prove them wrong. I was there because I was right. I realized then that the greatest victory wasn't seeing Mark lose his office or his status. It was the realization that my value had never been a variable in his long-term plan. He had tried to define me as a transient phase, a bridge to be crossed and then burned, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman he was dealing with. I wasn't a placeholder. I was the destination. My career, my integrity, and my future were never dependent on his permission or his praise. I had spent years building a legacy in the shadows, and now that I was standing in the light, I saw that the foundation I had laid was indestructible. As I concluded my speech to a standing ovation, I thought of Mark one last time, not with anger, but with a clinical kind of gratitude. By trying to humiliate me, he had inadvertently forced me to stop playing a role that was far too small for me. He had stripped away the distractions and left me with nothing but my own formidable strength. I walked off the stage and into a room that finally knew my name for all the right reasons. Some people mistake silence for weakness. I let him keep that mistake. Thank you for journeying through this story of resilience and reclaimed power. If you found Aaron's journey from a dismissed placeholder to a formidable leader inspiring, please consider subscribing to the channel to join our community. We believe every story of integrity deserves to be heard, and your support helps us bring more of these powerful narratives to life. We want to hear from you in the comments below. Did you anticipate the twist with Aunt Eleanor, or was there a moment where you stood up and cheered for Aaron's silent strength? Many of our viewers have shared that this story reminds them of their own professional or personal crossroads where they had to choose between staying quiet or standing tall. Your insights and experiences add so much depth to these discussions, so please share your thoughts and let us know what you think of the ultimate payoff. Was Mark's downfall satisfying enough, or do you think he got off too easy? Join the conversation and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Your engagement drives our channel forward, and we are grateful to have such a thoughtful and passionate audience sharing this space with us.